I can no longer stand at an altar built on obligation, while the true debt of my life remains unspoken and completely unpaid.
300 guests sat in silence as Richard Callahan stood at the altar, a ring pinched between his fingers, waiting for a woman he had promised the entire world to marry. Cameras flashed from every corner of the ballroom, capturing what the tabloids would later call the wedding of the decade. Everyone in that room believed they were about to witness a fairy tale, the kind where a self-made billionaire finally settles down with the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the country. But nobody in that crowd, not the bride, not her parents, not even the priest holding the vows, had any idea that Richard's eyes kept drifting toward the back of the room, toward a woman in a gray uniform quietly wiping down a serving table, unaware that the next 60 seconds would change both of their lives forever. The string quartet kept playing. Nobody had noticed yet that the groom had stopped listening to a word of it. Her name was Emily Hart, and she had worked as a cleaner for Callahan Enterprises for almost 4 years, mopping the same marble floors that Richard walked across every single day without ever once looking down. She wasn't invited to this wedding. She was working it, moving between tables long after midnight, picking up champagne glasses left behind by people who would never remember her face. She had no idea the groom even knew her name. So when Richard suddenly turned away from his bride, walked past 300 stunned guests, and stopped directly in front of Emily, nobody understood what they were witnessing. Least of all Emily herself, who stood frozen with a rag still in her hand as the richest man in the country reached for hers instead. For a moment, the entire ballroom simply stopped breathing. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Richard said next made the entire ballroom go completely silent, and by the time anyone understood the words leaving his mouth, it was already too late to stop what was coming. Because this wasn't a groom having second thoughts. This wasn't a man getting cold feet in front of his family and friends. This was a man who had been living a secret for years, one that traced back long before he ever owned a single building with his name on it, back to a time when Richard Callahan had nothing at all, and the only person who had ever shown him kindness wore the same gray uniform Emily was wearing tonight. Somewhere in the back rows, a guest would later say she felt the air itself change before anyone said a single word. To understand what was happening in that ballroom, you have to understand who these two people really were, and why their paths were never supposed to cross again. The bride waiting at the altar was Victoria Sinclair, only daughter of banking magnate Walter Sinclair, a man who had spent 30 years building an empire out of mergers and quiet threats disguised as business deals. This marriage was never really about love. It was a merger too, one that would combine Callahan Enterprises with the Sinclair banking dynasty and make both families untouchable for another generation. Victoria knew it. Her father had made sure of it. And somewhere behind her polished smile that night, she suspected something was wrong, though she never imagined the truth would involve a cleaner she had walked past without a glance an hour earlier. Who did Richard Callahan really answer to? And why would a man worth billions risk everything on a single moment in front of the people who mattered most to his empire? Was this love, guilt, or something buried far deeper than either? And what exactly did Emily Hart know that nobody else in that ballroom understood yet? What role, if any, did Walter Sinclair himself play in a story that began decades before his daughter ever met Richard Callahan? These were the questions that would follow all four of them long after this night ended. Questions that reporters would spend months trying to answer. Questions that would eventually pull apart a marriage that had been arranged before either Richard or Victoria had any real say in the matter at all. 10 years earlier, before the skyscrapers and the private jets, Richard Callahan was a 22-year-old with nothing but an unfinished business degree and a stack of unpaid bills. He had come from a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, the son of a mechanic named Frank Callahan, who lost his shop during the recession after 30 years of keeping the same 3 regulars afloat on credit. Richard watched his father hand over the keys to a bank representative without saying a word, and he promised himself that night he would never again stand somewhere so powerless. He arrived in the city with 2 suitcases, $400, and a business plan that collapsed within his first 6 months. undone by a partner who disappeared with what little capital they had raised together. He slept in a rented room above a laundromat that winter, the kind of place where the radiator worked maybe half the time and the landlord collected rent in cash on the first of every month without exception. He took whatever work he could find, unloading trucks before sunrise, washing dishes at a diner that let him eat the mistakes the kitchen threw out, convinced that failure was temporary and that success was simply a matter of enduring long enough. What he never told the reporters, the biographers, or even Victoria was that during the coldest stretch of that winter, when his hot plate stopped working and he had gone 3 days on nothing but coffee, a woman he had never properly met began quietly leaving food outside his door, wrapped in a dish towel, without ever once asking for anything in return. Her name was Margaret Hart, and she worked as a live-in housekeeper for the building's owner, while raising a daughter alone 2 floors above the laundromat. Margaret had noticed Richard's light staying on too late, and his mail piling up unopened, the small signs of a young man barely holding on, and something in her recognized the exact particular shape of that kind of hunger. She never explained herself, never lingered to be thanked, and for 4 months she left soup, bread, sometimes just a few dollars folded into a napkin, until Richard finally found steady work loading freight at the docks and no longer needed what she was quietly giving him. He never learned her full name that winter. He only remembered her face and the dish towel she always used, blue with a frayed white edge. Margaret Hart was Emily's mother, though Emily herself had only been a small child at the time, too young to remember the stranger her mother once helped 2 floors below their apartment. Margaret never told her daughter the full story either, believing kindness didn't need to be remembered by anyone to matter. She raised Emily on her own after Emily's father left when Emily was 6, working 3 jobs at once, cleaning offices before dawn, watching an elderly neighbor's grandchildren in the afternoon, and taking in mending on weekends, never once complaining within earshot of her daughter about how tired the work left her. She passed away from a sudden heart condition when Emily was 19, leaving her daughter with nothing but a small apartment, an unfinished education, and the same quiet determination that had defined Margaret's entire life. Emily took the only job she could find after her mother died, cleaning offices at night while attempting to finish an accounting degree during the day, the same arrangement her mother had once managed for years without ever once falling behind. She never realized the company she worked for, Callahan Enterprises, belonged to the same young man her mother had quietly kept alive during a winter neither of them ever spoke about again. Emily simply knew the building, the elevators, the particular hum of the fluorescent lights on the 14th floor, where the executive offices sat empty by the time her shift began each night. She had walked past photographs of Richard Callahan in the lobby 100 times without feeling anything at all, the way anyone walks past a stranger's face in a magazine. Richard discovered the connection almost by accident, nearly a year before the wedding, while reviewing employee files during a routine audit of his company's third-party cleaning contracts. Margaret Hart's name appeared on an old paycheck stub attached to Emily's employment record, listed as a prior emergency contact from years earlier, and something in his memory clicked into place with a force he hadn't expected. He remembered the dish towel. He remembered the soup left in a chipped bowl outside his door on nights he had genuinely believed nobody in the entire city knew his name. He sat in his office for nearly an hour that afternoon, staring at a payroll document, unable to explain to his assistant why a routine audit had suddenly left him unable to speak. He spent weeks quietly confirming what he suspected, hiring a private investigator named Daniel Cole through a shell arrangement so nobody inside his own company would ask questions, terrified of what it would mean if he was wrong, and even more terrified of what it would mean if he was right. Daniel confirmed within days that Margaret Hart had indeed lived in that same building above the laundromat, had indeed worked as a housekeeper there during the exact winter Richard remembered, and had a daughter named Emily, who had inherited both her mother's face and her habit of working through exhaustion without complaint. When the confirmation finally arrived, Richard realized the woman who had kept him alive when he had nothing was gone. But her daughter was working 2 floors beneath his own office every single night of the week. He never approached Emily directly, worried that revealing the truth too soon, without any real plan for what came after, would complicate a debt he felt he could never fully repay with a single conversation. Instead, he watched from a careful distance, quietly ensuring she was never mistreated by a supervisor, never overlooked for a promotion she had earned, never left without support when her department's hours were cut during a slow financial quarter. He arranged, through channels traced back to nobody in particular, a small scholarship fund that happened to cover the exact gap in Emily's tuition the semester she nearly withdrew. Emily noticed these kindnesses and couldn't explain them, but she never once suspected they were connected to a CEO she had never personally met and had no reason to think knew she existed. Meanwhile, Richard's engagement to Victoria Sinclair moved forward exactly as his board and Victoria's father had planned months earlier. A business arrangement dressed carefully in the language of romance for the cameras and the shareholders alike. Walter Sinclair had first proposed the match during a private dinner 18 months prior, framing it less as a suggestion and more as the natural next step for two companies whose combined assets would create the largest privately held financial group on the East Coast. Richard, still carrying the instincts of a man who had once had nothing, understood exactly what kind of leverage Walter held over smaller firms who crossed him, and he agreed to the engagement the way a man agrees to terms he knows he cannot yet afford to refuse. What Richard did not know, and would not discover until weeks after the wedding collapsed entirely, was that Walter Sinclair had his own history with Margaret Hart, one considerably darker than a young man leaving soup outside a stranger's door. Walter had, in fact, owned the very building above the laundromat through a holding company decades earlier, before consolidating his fortune into banking. Margaret had worked there not simply as a housekeeper for a landlord, but specifically for Walter's family. And when her husband fell ill, and she fell 3 weeks behind on rent during that same winter, it was Walter's company that ordered her quiet eviction rather than allow a single exception to be made for a woman who had served his family faithfully for years without a single complaint on record. Margaret had never told anyone the name of the man who evicted her, not even Emily, carrying the humiliation of it quietly the same way she carried everything else. Walter, for his part, had buried the incident so completely that he had genuinely forgotten the woman's name until his own legal team, running a standard background review ahead of the wedding to ensure no embarrassing connections existed between the two families, flagged an old eviction record tied to a building he no longer publicly owned. When Walter realized the woman he had evicted decades earlier was the same Margaret Hart whose daughter now worked for his future son-in-law, he made a single, cold decision: to accelerate the wedding timeline and ensure no one, especially Richard, ever had a reason to look closely enough to connect the two threads together. The wedding itself was set for the largest ballroom the city had ever rented for a private event, a deliberate symbol of two empires joining hands in front of cameras from every major outlet in the country. Walter Sinclair had insisted on every detail personally, from the imported flowers to a guest list curated to include senators, executives, and old money families who rarely appeared in public together outside of funerals. Victoria wore a dress that had taken 11 months to design, and Richard stood at the altar rehearsing vows written for him by a corporate speechwriter rather than composed in his own words. Nobody in that ballroom knew that 3 days earlier, Richard had finally decided he could no longer go through with a marriage built entirely on obligation, while the one true debt of his life remained completely unpaid. When Richard turned away from Victoria and walked toward Emily, it wasn't a spontaneous decision made in a single reckless second under the wedding lights. It was the final moment of a choice he had been quietly building toward for months, one he had almost made a dozen times before losing his nerve at the last possible moment. Standing in front of Emily, still holding the wedding ring meant for another woman entirely, Richard said the words that would end up on every news channel by morning. He told her who her mother once was to him, what she had done for a stranger with absolutely nothing, and that he could no longer stand at an altar built on obligation, while the true debt of his life remained unspoken and completely unpaid. The ballroom exploded into chaos within seconds of Richard finishing his sentence. Walter Sinclair rose from his seat and demanded answers. Security began moving toward Richard on instinct before anyone had actually given the order, and reporters who had been invited to cover a fairy tale wedding suddenly found themselves covering the collapse of one of the most anticipated business mergers of the decade. Victoria stood frozen at the altar, humiliated in front of nearly everyone she had ever known, while her father began making phone calls to his legal team before the ceremony had even officially been declared over. Emily, overwhelmed and confused, was quickly ushered out of the ballroom by hotel staff, who assumed she was somehow responsible for the disruption, unaware that she had said almost nothing at all the entire time. By morning, photographs of the moment had already reached every major outlet in the country, and the story mutated within hours from a broken engagement into something the internet could not stop dissecting. News anchors debated on air whether Richard Callahan had suffered a genuine breakdown or orchestrated an elaborate stunt to escape a marriage he had never actually wanted in the first place. A financial columnist named Sarah Whitfield was the first to publish a piece questioning whether the entire moment had been staged deliberately to collapse the merger before it legally closed, a theory that spread faster than anyone at Callahan Enterprises could manage to contain. Walter Sinclair's legal team began drafting breach of agreement letters within 24 hours, hinting publicly that Callahan Enterprises had violated commitments that went far beyond a broken engagement between two families. Reporters camped outside Emily's apartment building for nearly a week, desperate for any statement from a woman who had gone from anonymous cleaner to the center of a national scandal overnight without ever having asked for any of it. Emily lost sleep, lost her sense of safety walking to her own front door, and very nearly lost her job entirely when a board member loyal to the Sinclair family, a man named Gerald Thompson, pushed quietly to have her dismissed and paid a settlement to disappear from public view before the story grew any larger. Some outlets ran anonymous quotes suggesting Emily had somehow manipulated the entire situation for a payout, despite the plain fact that she had not spoken publicly a single time since the wedding collapsed. For a stretch of nearly 2 weeks, it looked as though Richard's public confession had been a mistake with no good ending anywhere in sight. Sponsors began quietly distancing themselves from Callahan Enterprises. Shareholders demanded an emergency meeting to address what they called reputational risk, and internal memos leaked suggesting some board members wanted Richard removed as CEO entirely, citing instability. Sarah Whitfield's earlier theory about a staged stunt gained traction in certain circles, fueled by anonymous sources inside the Sinclair camp who had every incentive to make Richard look calculating rather than sincere. Richard, watching the story mutate into something increasingly false, understood that silence would only let other people control a narrative belonging to no one but himself, Emily, and the memory of a woman neither of them had properly honored yet. It was Daniel Cole, the investigator Richard had quietly hired months earlier, who uncovered the second half of the story almost by accident, while double-checking old property records connected to the building above the laundromat. Daniel found the decades-old eviction filing under one of Walter Sinclair's dissolved holding companies, cross-referenced it against Margaret Hart's name, and brought the documents to Richard within a single evening, understanding immediately what he had actually found. Richard sat with the papers for a long time before saying anything at all, piecing together a decision that suddenly made a great deal more sense: why Walter had pushed so hard and so fast for a wedding date nobody else at the company had ever felt any real urgency about. Richard called a private press conference 3 days after Daniel's discovery, standing alone at a single podium without lawyers or publicists, scripting a single word of what he intended to say. He told the full story publicly for the first time, of the winter he nearly gave up entirely, of a stranger who fed him without ever asking for anything, and of discovering years later that her daughter had been working beneath his own roof the entire time without either of them knowing. He then read, calmly and without embellishment, the eviction filing Daniel had found, revealing to the entire country that Walter Sinclair himself had once ordered Margaret Hart's eviction decades earlier, and had rushed his own daughter's wedding specifically to bury that history before anyone thought to look closely enough to find it. The public reaction shifted almost overnight. Sarah Whitfield published a follow-up piece retracting her earlier theory entirely, this time laying out the full timeline in detail, from Margaret's quiet kindness to Walter's quiet cruelty, decades before either family had any idea their futures would eventually intersect this completely. Walter Sinclair, facing sudden scrutiny from his own shareholders and a wave of public anger he had never anticipated, quietly withdrew every legal threat against Callahan Enterprises within a week, choosing silence over a fight he now understood he could not possibly win in public opinion. Gerald Thompson, the board member who had pushed to have Emily quietly dismissed, resigned from Callahan Enterprises less than a month later, his position having become untenable the moment the full story became public knowledge. Victoria, watching her father's carefully built reputation collapse in real time from her own apartment across the city, felt something shift inside her that she hadn't fully expected to feel. She had spent her entire adult life inside arrangements chosen for her by other people, and for the first time she admitted, quietly and only to herself at first, that she had never truly wanted this marriage either, regardless of how the wedding had actually ended. Weeks later, she reached out to Richard directly, not out of anger over the humiliation of that night, but to finally say aloud what neither of them had ever said honestly to each other before the ceremony began. She told him she forgave him, not because his choice hadn't hurt her deeply, but because she recognized in his decision a freedom she wished she'd had the courage to take for herself years earlier. Victoria's relationship with her father changed permanently after that conversation. She confronted Walter directly about Margaret Hart's eviction, demanding to know how long he had known and why he had chosen silence over simply telling the truth from the very beginning. Walter, for the first time in Victoria's memory, offered no defense at all, only an admission that fear of public embarrassment had outweighed every other consideration he might have made differently, given the chance again. Victoria eventually left the city entirely, stepping back from her father's business circles altogether and building an independent career in a different industry, one she later described in a rare interview as the very first decision in her adult life that had belonged entirely to her. Emily, meanwhile, struggled for months to process a truth that had completely rewritten her understanding of her own mother. She had spent years believing Margaret simply worked hard because that was the only option life had ever given a woman in her position, never realizing her mother's small, quiet acts of kindness had shaped the entire fate of a stranger who would one day become one of the most powerful men in the country. When Richard finally sat with Emily privately, away from cameras and headlines and every other person with an opinion about their story, he didn't offer her money or a position within the company she hadn't earned herself. He simply thanked her, on behalf of the man he used to be, for a mother whose name history had almost erased completely, and asked for nothing in return except the chance to actually know her. In the months that followed, Emily chose to keep her job at Callahan Enterprises, refusing every offer that felt like charity rather than genuine respect for the work she had already done. She finished the accounting degree she had paused years earlier after her mother's death, this time with a quiet confidence that came from finally knowing exactly where she had come from and exactly what her mother's life had actually meant to someone else. Richard restructured leadership within Callahan Enterprises over the following year, stepping back from arrangements dictated purely by boardrooms and family alliances, choosing instead to rebuild the company's culture around values his own mother had once tried to teach him before poverty took nearly everything else from their family in Ohio. Richard also established, quietly and without a press release, a scholarship fund in Margaret Hart's name for children of hourly workers within his own company, ensuring the fund operated independently of his personal relationship with Emily so it could never be mistaken for anything other than what it actually was, a genuine debt finally being repaid in full. He returned once, that following spring, to the small town outside Dayton, where his father's shop once stood, and stood quietly in front of the building for a long time before driving back to the city without telling anyone where he had gone that day. Some debts, he had come to understand, could never truly be settled with money alone, only honored as completely as a person was able to manage. Richard and Emily's relationship never became the tabloid romance reporters had initially hoped to sell to their readers. It became something considerably quieter instead, built slowly over shared dinners where Richard finally learned the small, specific details of Margaret Hart's life that no paycheck stub or eviction filing could ever fully capture on its own. He learned about her laugh, her stubbornness, the particular way she had refused help from anyone even when she needed it most desperately, Emily, in turn, finally understood why unexplained kindnesses had quietly followed her throughout her entire adult life, and why a stranger's debt had protected her long before she ever once knew his name or had any reason to expect it. What began as a scandal broadcast across every major network in the country eventually became something far more personal for everyone involved. A story less about a collapsed wedding and more about the actual weight of an unpaid debt, and what it finally costs a person to set that weight down honestly, in front of everyone, rather than carry it quietly for the rest of their life. Was justice truly served that night, or did an entire ballroom simply witness one man deciding that some debts matter more than any business arrangement ever could hope to? Would you have recognized Emily Hart standing quietly at the back of that room, or would you have walked past her the same way 300 wedding guests did without a second thought? What do you think really made Richard Callahan finally choose the truth over the comfortable lie he had been living inside for years? And what do you think should have happened to Walter Sinclair once the full truth about Margaret Hart finally came out into the open? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd genuinely love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before you go, I've handpicked one more incredible story for you. If you enjoyed this one, I'm confident you'll love what's waiting on your screen next. Click it now, and let the next unforgettable journey begin. Thank you for watching Echoes of Tales. I'll see you in the next story.